Good morning, everybody. I'm Andrea Pagliardi from ASIF Italia, the association that brings together people who work in animation field. And I'm also the curator of Sotto18. Maybe I can. Thank you, sorry. Better. Sotto18 Film Festival, and I am the curator of animation section. So that's the reason why they choose me to introduce this panel. Today we have the big opportunity to talk about a movie, a documentary, which is one of the best films realized in the 2021. It's not my opinion. The film is Flea, as you probably read in the program. Since it was released in June, it has never stopped winning awards. Sundance Film Festival, it won a Crystal at Annecy Film Festival, which is probably the most important film festival for animation movies in the world. He is nominated, the Critics' Choice Documentary Awards, which is one of the most important awards for the documentaries. And then Toronto, Autumn Film, Animation Film, Montclair Film Festival, Newport Beach Film Festival, and so on. It was screened for the first time in Cannes this year, and it is selected as the Danish Oscar candidate for the best movie. For Denmark. Rumors says that probably is one of the favorites to win the Academy Awards for 2 or 3 sections, maybe documentaries, maybe animation. So it's a very important movie. But the reason we choose it for Torino film industry is that I think there are 3 main reasons. The first one is that documentary and animation is one of the topics the festival would like to focus on. The second reason is that this particular documentary has a very interesting story about its production and the making of. The third reason, which is, in my opinion, the most important, is that this documentary tells the story about a man. About a man, but, and the story of his fugue, of his escape from Afghanistan, and a very long trip all around the world to get at the end in Denmark. But it is also the story of every refugees. And nowadays, we all see what is happening in Afghanistan today and the past days. It's more and more actual. The film has a strong capacity to tell the story of everybody who has a similar experience. So it's, in my opinion, is really universal. And when you succeed in transform a personal story in a universal one, you do a very important service to the humanities. We have the opportunity today to have a conversation with Jonas Poher Rasmussen, which is the director. But first, before introducing him, I think it's better if we see the trailer.
Prøv en lille smule længere op. Meget lidt. Så hvis du ligesom lukker øjnene nu, ja, og prøver at trække vejret sådan dybt ind. Hvad betyder ordet hjem for dig?
Hjem er noget, som er trygt.
Kaboul, les attaques des Moudjahidines repris.
fortalt din livshistorie før?
Nej. Vi skal ud. Det er nu. Vildt dårligt samvittighed, at min bror han bliver tilbage. Vi flygtede med menneskesmuglerne. Det værste mennesker i mit liv.
Har du fortalt Kasper nogle af de her historier overhovedet?
Nej. Det tager tid at stole på folk. Det går rundt. Og tænk tilbage. Så det er min fortid, og det jeg kan ikke flygte fra det, og jeg har heller ikke lyst. Jeg kan mærke, at der skal ske noget. Der starter jo min historie.
Ah, okay, you're here. Hi, Jonas. Nice to meet you again.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Well, I think we could be start from the beginning, in particular from you. You are director of TV and radio documentaries, and it's the first time for you with animation. So, who are you? Who is Jonas Rasmussen?
Well, I'm a Danish documentary filmmaker. I have, as you said, a background in radio. And the very first film I did was a documentary about my grandfather, who was a quite famous poet here in Denmark. And when he died, the family gathered in his house, and we were looking for the will, and we couldn't find it. And in the search for this will, I found these old VHS tapes, and I put them in the player and started watching films he had done himself back in the 50s. And I realized that I actually didn't know my grandfather very well. And that was kind of the trigger. That was kind of where I started doing my first film, because I wanted to explore what was underneath. To me, he'd always just been the fun grandfather who had a lot of candy for me. But I saw that there was a story here to be told, and that was the first film I did. And from then, I kind of worked with storytelling first in documentaries and in radio documentaries. And I went to film school in Copenhagen, where I did fiction. And after that, I've done 3 long documentaries, and Flea is the 3rd one. And I think I really like working with documentaries where you can kind of get a physical aspect into it. With Flea, it's really about how to bring the past back to life through animation. And the last one I did, called What He Did, it was a story about a killing, a guy who had killed his boyfriend. And there we used the theater to kind of bring physicality and bring stories from the past back to life. So I really like to work with how do you bring stories to life, how do you make them feel current. So that was a bit of background on me.
Okay. Your documentaries are all focused on people. I mean, Searching for Bill is a sort of road movie on a man who chasing the thief that stole his car. Very strange story. What he did of the 2015 is on the murder of the writer, or a Danish writer, Christian Kempman. I hope I pronounced it well. Well, Flea is, of course, on the story of your close friend, Amin Nawabi, which is a pseudonym, but anyway. And then the question is, what do you think is the role of a documentary? Is it important, the fact that you always start from stories about single people?
No, I don't think necessarily, but that's really what I'm drawn to at least. For some reason, I'm really drawn to stories about marginalized people and how people cope with being in a difficult situation. In Searching for Bill, it was really a story about the recession in the U.S., about people who lost their homes and their jobs and their cars. And with what he did, it was a story about this guy who had killed his boyfriend and served his time, then got out. But how do you start living a life when you have killed someone, killed the person you love? And with Flea, Amin being kind of double marginalized, being both gay and being a refugee, and having a hard time finding a place where he felt he could be who he was and being honest to who he was. So this is really, the core of my stories and what I like to talk about. But I think I've seen plenty of films that are about multiple characters that also work very well. But I really like the dynamic of the conversation between two people.
Who is Amin? Could you tell the story about this close friend of you? Because it's the starting point of all the work behind this documentary. And on the occasion, could you tell to our audience something more about Flea? Not only the plot, but in particular, what is Flea for you? What represent?
Yes. So I met Amin when I was 15 years old, where he showed up in my hometown. I grew up in this very small town here in Denmark with like 500 people in it. And Amin, he arrived all by himself from Afghanistan and stayed in foster care with a family just next door to where I lived. And he learned Danish really fast. And we started meeting up at the bus stop every morning, going to high school. And we slowly became very good friends. And already back then, I was curious about how and why he had gotten to my village. But, he didn't want to talk about it. He just plain out said, I don't want to talk about it. And I, of course, respected that. But it also, created a curiosity that I kind of had within me. And there were these rumors going around in high school about how and why he had gotten to Denmark. Some said that he had walked all the way from Denmark to Afghanistan, which of course wasn't true. And also some people said that he had seen his family getting killed. And there were all these stories going around. So it became kind of this mythical story at our high school and in our group of friends. But he didn't want to talk about it at all. And then, years went by, and I think like 15 years ago, I asked him if I could do a radio documentary about his story, about his past. And he said no. And he said that he knew that he would have to share his story at some point, but he still didn't feel ready. But when he was ready, he would like to share it with me, and then we could do something about it, either do a book or radio or something. But we still hadn't found the right format. I hadn't found the right format to tell his story. So I kind of had this in the back of my head for many years. And then 8 years ago, I was invited for this workshop in Denmark called Anidux, which is a workshop where they combine animators and documentary filmmakers to develop ideas for animated documentaries. And they asked me if I had an idea, and I thought, but maybe this is the way to tell Amin's story. So I met with him, and I asked him again if he would like to share his story, and then we could make it into an animated documentary. And he said yes, and he said that he felt ready to share his story, and he felt the need to share his story. And he also felt that animation was maybe the good way to do it, because what you see in the film is the first time he shares a story, and it's a very traumatic story, and it's not easy for him to talk about. So the fact that he could be anonymous behind the animation was really what freed him up to feel safe about sharing his story, because the fact that he would be public about a story that is so hard to talk about was difficult to him to think about, because, you know, if he would be recognized in the street and people would come up to him and ask him about, ask him to talk about things in his life that he doesn't like talking about, that really kind of put him off. So the fact that he could stay anonymous and still keep control over when he would like to talk about these things was really what helped him to say, okay, but this is the way to do it, and I'm ready to do it. So that was really the genesis of Flee and where we started. And then it took many years to make. One thing was the funding was really difficult because it's an animation film, which is quite expensive, but funded in the documentary world where there's not a lot of money. So it took a long time. But this was actually for the better, because I had never done animation before, so I had to learn the craft. I had to learn the process of making animation, and Amin had to slowly become more and more ready to dive into his memories. It was a long process, and I think I did between 15 and 20 interviews with Amin during the span of 3 or 4 years, where we kind of slowly went deeper and deeper into his memories of what happened when he grew up in Afghanistan and when he had to flee with his family. And I used this technique of interviewing that I used in radio before. I don't know if you noticed in the trailer, but he's actually laying down during the interviews, and he has his eyes closed and he talks in present tense, which is a technique of interviewing I use for radio, because when you work in radio, you don't have an image, so you really need your subject to be very descriptive, especially when they talk about things that happened in the past. So you need them to paint a picture for the audience, and by having the subject laying down, eyes closed, talking present tense, you kind of bring them back to a specific situation. So every time he starts talking about a certain memory, I always start out with asking him to explain the location he's in, the room he's in. In the beginning of the film, he's in his childhood home in a garden, outside his childhood home with his siblings. And I would then ask him to kind of describe the garden. What kind of plants were there? What are the colors of the walls? What did the house look like? What does he see outside the walls? And all these are things which would kind of give the animators a lot of detail to work from. But it would also bring him back in the situation, and he would start to, generate new memories, and he would be very present in the way of talking. And instead of just doing a talking head shot of him retelling his past, he kind of relived it in front of me, and the audience is then invited to relive the story with him. And the film is called Flee, and yes, it's a story about a guy fleeing Afghanistan going to Denmark. But it's even more so a story about what it does to a person to not be able to be honest to who you are. When he was a kid growing up in Afghanistan and he was gay, he wasn't able to be openly gay, so he had to hide that all of his youth. And then when he came to Denmark, he was given this fake story by the human traffickers who got him there, and he kind of had to hide his past when he came to Denmark. And so he's done that for more than 20 years. So all of his life, he's always had to hide something, hide parts of himself. And this, creates a certain distance to everyone around you, because if you keep secrets, you are always afraid of exposing yourself. So he kept people at a distance. And that just kind of, it just creates conflict within him because he can't be who he is. So the film is basically a story about a guy trying to find a place in the world where he can be who he is with everything that entails, with his sexuality, with his past, and everything else.
Okay, let's talk about the technique, the language. You said something before, but I would like to delve more deeply in the choice you did. Why did you choose the animation as a language to tell the story of a man?
But one reason was because of anonymity. But also, you know, because the story takes place for the most part in the past, so the fact that you could make the past come back alive, you could, you know, make Afghanistan in the 80s come back alive, Moscow in the 90s, you could make his childhood home come back alive, and you could place him in the past and make it feel current. That was a key factor to why we chose animation, but also because, you know, Flea is really also a story about memory and trauma. And the fact that we use animation enable us to be a lot more expressive about these things. So instead of, at times you could really hear it in the testimony, actually, hear it in the voice, that sometimes there are things that he has a really hard time talking about, or he has a hard time remembering. And there I thought, okay, you could hear in his voice that it changed, and I thought, okay, but this change, we need to see it in the animation as well. So whenever he starts to talk about something that's really difficult to talk about, we go into his emotion instead, and the animation becomes a lot more surreal and expressive, and kind of shows what's inside of him more so than trying to show, you know, what things look like. There's a part of the film where he has two sisters who are smuggled inside a container to go to Sweden, and he wasn't there. So when he talks about it, you know, he wouldn't know what it looked like inside that container. But his emotion was there. You know, the fear he had, the concern he had about what was going on inside that container was there. So instead of showing what the container really looked like from the inside, we said, okay, now we're going to be a lot more expressive, a lot more surreal, and show the fear of a 12-year-old boy who's concerned about what's going on with his sisters.
And was it difficult for you to work with the different kind of animation techniques? I mean, in the phase of the decision of how tell different part of your story. There are parts which are only drawn by a black pencil, other one which are colored, or other sequences which are live action sequences, archived sequences. How do you mix together these different styles, and why you did so?
But you know, the different styles of animation was really, one was really trying to be realistic and authentic about what had happened. Like everything came from him telling the story, and you had the authentic voice underneath the animation. So we really tried to be as exact as possible in the animation. So Afghanistan in the 80s felt like Afghanistan in the 80s. And we had this archival material throughout the film, kind of to remind people that, you know, this is a true story. Underneath the animation, there's a real person who experienced these things. And the reason why he has to flee is because of historical events in the world we live in that happened, that forced him and his family to flee. And I wanted to remind people throughout the film that this is, you know, this is not a fiction, this is documentary. And that's why the archive is in there. And then we would take, you know, elements directly from the archive footage and kind of see, okay, but this is what Afghanistan looked like in the 80s. And then we would draw it in the animation style and put it in the animation. So it felt like, you know, the archive and the animation kind of, that we could go back and forth seamlessly and that they were tied together. So it felt like the same world. And then, as I said, there's this more simplistic kind of graphical black and white animation. And that's really, you know, it really came from his voice and the way he talked, when he talked about things that were traumatic to him. I thought, okay, we need to see this because this is not about how things looked. This is about emotion. This is about fear. It's about anger. It's about being scared. It's about being frustrated. And we need to see that. And with the animation, you could really lift that. And somewhat it felt more honest to to the stories he told, because you know, some things he had a hard time remembering, and you could tell that he just kind of when he talked, all of a sudden he would just kind of stop, and there would be like, you know, he would talk a lot slower, and you could tell that this was about his emotion and not about what things looked like. So those were like the reasons why we made the combination. But really the core of it is this testimony, and we really spent a lot of time to create authenticity. It was core throughout that this needed to feel authentic and real, because it's a real story and it's a real human being behind the animation.
Okay, I would like to go inside a more technical aspect, because your movie has it did a sort of revolution in the process of making animation movies. As far as I read, usually in documentaries, every directors have to do with hundreds of hours of footage. In the animation is the opposite. The animation costs a lot for even for a minute of animation. So usually the animation directors tend to do the movie in the storyboard phase. So the cutted part are very little. But you did quite the reverse and make the process of animation before. You work a lot in the editing phase, I read. And you work with the animation, rough animation, I think. Well, could you explain us much better than what I have done now? How did you work with animation, and did you work with the editor?
Yeah, but it's true. Coming from a background in documentary, the process of making this was very different, because when you make documentaries, you tend to you go out and shoot your material, and then you bring it back home to the editing room, and then you kind of shape your story from the material you got. So you kind of become a slave of the material you shot, which means that if you shot a scene and you didn't get a proper close-up shot of one of the characters in the film, then you don't have it, and you just have to work around it and figure out how to build the scene the best possible way. But because it's animation and you kind of do the editing before you shoot, because you don't start animating before the animatic is locked. You could kind of be very precise in a way that I hadn't experienced before in your editing, because when you were building a scene, and if you were missing that close-up shot, then you just asked the storyboard artist to make it for you, which made that you could always ask for the shots you needed, which was an amazing experience. Also a little overwhelming, because there were so many possibilities all of a sudden, of course, but just the precision you work with in animation was really amazing to experience, that you could be so precise in your way of storytelling. And of course, I had shot things before, but just the sound. I had also filmed it, and we could use the film footage as reference for the animation later on. But I did like a kind of radio documentary first, so it was just a sound edit of the testimony, and I put in a little bit of sound effects, and there is voice actors in the film, and I then did scratch voices for all the characters in the beginning, for sisters and mother and father and brothers and human traffickers and all that. I did scratch voices for that, and put it into this radio edit that we used, and then we started to get storyboards and put that in, and we could kind of build it from there. But we didn't start animating anything until we were sure the story was locked, that the film was there. And then animation could begin. And it was a long process of me and the animator. I had an amazing animator called Jonas, who also did the edit for another round that won the Academy Award last year, and a ton of other amazing films. And he hadn't done animation before either. So it was really a process of the two of us really going deep into the story and figuring out how can we do this and how can we tell the story in the best way. And kind of simultaneously, we were figuring out the visual style of the film with my art director, Jess Nichols, and Guillaume Douce, who was on in the beginning. We created this art Bible where we just, found reference in a lot of other films, animated films, also live action films. We looked at a lot of visual artists to how to treat, color and light and shadow and compositions. And slowly we collected all this material into an art bible that we're going to use when we started animation.
Thank you. I would like to come back to the production process in general. It was a low-budget movie for an animation movie, a big-budget movie for a documentary, of course. Reading the list of producers, we can find a lot of names, a lot of companies. Would you like to tell us how the process was built from the start, from the beginning to the end of the productions? How do you involve the people who play their role in your documentary?
Yeah, so it was really a big task because, as you said, animation is quite expensive and there's not a lot of money in the documentary world. And because it's a documentary, we had to fund the film in the documentary world. And this meant that in the beginning, nobody really believed that this film was going to be made. Because whenever we went somewhere and pitched the film, they said, oh, this sounds amazing. And then they looked at our budget and saw that it was like 5 times or 10 times higher than they would normally see. And I said, okay, but this can't be done. You're never going to find that kind of money. So it was really a long process of my producers being really persistent and kind of slowly building momentum. And in the beginning, we got some funding from the Danish Film Institute, just to develop the idea and to develop the visual style and starting out. But then it wasn't actually till we had France coming in. Arte France saw a teaser we did for the film and came on board and gave us a bunch of development money. And then when they come on board, slowly people start to realize, okay, but maybe this can be done. And with Arte France also came the French Film Institute, Sundance, and 2 regional funds from France. And then we had Norway and Sweden as co-producing finances as well. And this kind of opened up for some a Scandinavian film fund. And then we had a lot of pre-sales all over Europe. Also, I Wonder Pictures, Andrea Romeo, came on board quite early in the process. And so slowly we got a lot of collaborators all over Europe, and this enabled us to apply for these pan-European film funds, Creative Europe, and a bunch of others. You should have my producer here to really tell everything about this. But it was a long process, and slowly we gathered all the money to make the film. And it was long and it was exhausting and it was difficult. But I think in hindsight, I think it was actually good for the process of the film because I had to learn to make animation. I had to learn the process, and Amin had to be ready to share his story, and it took years. So the fact that it took so long to finance was actually beneficial in the end.
Okay. What was the more difficult moment in all the production?
I think the weight, to wait money, and also there was this at the very end. We were almost greenlit and were ready to go into production, but we still needed the last part of money, and we then got some American money in. And it was very close, like everyone, we had the whole team, everyone was ready to work, but we still didn't have the final money, and we had to push. And it was a little nerve-wracking to kind of know if we would get this money and be able to really do the film or not. So it was, that was a tough period.
Okay. I would like to come back to the hero of this film, Amin. And I'm curious to ask you, how does he feels about this movie and about even also about what happens now in Afghanistan.
So the first time Amin saw the film, it was a very emotional experience. He was very moved by watching the film, but he also said that he didn't know if he got moved because it was good film or just because it was his story on screen. So he was nervous when we had the premiere. We had the premiere at Sundance January this year, and he was very nervous about it. But equally, relieved when it got out, and it got very, very good reviews, and people reacted to it very strongly, but in a good way. I think he'd always, been a little concerned if people would be able to relate to his story. Again, because, he is double marginalized, being a refugee and gay, and he was a little concerned if people were neither, if they would still be able to relate and if the story would resonate within them. But it really did, and people got very moved by it and engaged very well with the film. And I know that meant a lot to him. And for him on a personal level as well, he carried this story around for so many years, and it was a big burden to kind of get rid of and to get the story out there and share it. And now, he's able to share his story with people when he feels like it, and he's open about it. And the fact that he, his past and present never really connected, that he always had to keep his past a secret, and to finally be able to connect them and made him just feel more like a whole person. So the process for him has been very beneficial. And now the fact that he can talk about his past really means a lot to him.
Okay. What are your future projects? I know you are now collecting the successes about this film, but making an animation movie, I think it changes you. So I'm curious to know if you would like in the future to come back to animation, to do other animation movies, maybe even documentaries.
No, but it was really an amazing process and to make Flea, and I really enjoyed the process. And so I would love to work in animation before. But to me, it's really here with Flea. It made sense to use animation, and I think it has to make sense. I don't want to make animation just for the sake of making animation. It needs to make sense. So I think it's really the story that dictates the form. The film I did before called What He Did, I used the theater. This time I used animation. I would love to use animation again, but it needs to make sense with the story underneath it. So I have an animation project that I'm working on now. I'm writing a script for an adaptation of these Danish graphic novels called the Dane Trilogy. And it's the story of the father of the artist who made the graphic novels. And his father grew up in Turkey and was into the military and deserted, and was then sent to military prison and got tortured. And then he came to Denmark to get away. And then he didn't know the language. He didn't have an education. All he knew was kind of how to fight because he learned that in the army. So he kind of started to have a career in the drug world here in Denmark, and ended up being this quite big drug lord here in Copenhagen. But it's really a story about violence and how violence dehumanizes you. So that's a project I'm working on now. It's still early, and all that's going on with Flea is a little distracting right now. So I don't have as much time as I would like to sit down and write. But that's one project, and then I have a couple of other projects, one in the US and one here that I'm slowly starting up, and we'll see where it goes. But right now, my main focus is on getting Flea out there into the world, and it's premiering in Italy in February with the I Wonder Pictures, and I'm going to New York tomorrow, where it's gonna be released on December 3rd in New York and Los Angeles. So most of my time goes on campaigning for the film and getting it out there to as broad an audience as possible.
Okay, I have a last question, a philosophical one. And then I will ask to our audience if there are questions, because we have to finish 10 minutes before what is communicated on the program. The philosophical question is this one. Summing, in some way, it sums up everything we said during this meeting. The animated documentary is a particular genre of documentaries used to tell the reality, to tell things that real happened in a strange way. It's not a new genre, a new type of documentary, because the first documentaries are made at the beginning of the 20th century. I was thinking about Winsor McCay, The Sinking of Lusitania, but there are a lot of examples, even Disney, for the war propaganda. Even nowadays, I think to Walzer von Bashir and your beautiful movie. The philosophical question is, why and in which way the fiction can tell more than about the world we are living? Why it's so powerful? The fiction, the animation, which has succeed in telling how the world works and how the world, what happened around us.
I think there's more things to that. I think to me, the main thing is that, you know, we're exposed to so many stories all the time about people who are struggling. With my case with refugees, we're exposed to so many refugee stories all the time in our news feeds, in the TV, in newspapers. They're all over these stories. And you can't take all of it in. You kind of start to defend yourself and say, okay, but I can't take all this in, because then you're just gonna, you know, go to bed and never get up again, because there's so many really difficult stories out there, and especially when you have to relate to a human face. You know, when you relate to a human face who's struggling, I think you think, okay, but I need to help, but you can't, and that just becomes really kind of, so that makes it really hard to look at people who are struggling. So I think that because it's animation, you have this kind of layer between. And it does become as hard to look at, because you don't have the human face to relate to. Now it's an animation, and you start to listen more, and you can actually listen to the story and take it in another way than you can if you had to also relate to the human being behind it. That was my experience at least. I saw Walter Bashir cinema here in Copenhagen when it came out, I think in 2010, and that's when I realized that this was something that you could do. Animated documentaries, and Walter Bashir, like Flea, also deals with trauma and really difficult things. I sat through the film, and you know, I listened to everything, I experienced it, and then it hit me. You know, at the very end of the film, where you see these crying Lebanese women, I got hit by the fact that this was all real. There was behind the animation, you have real people. But I didn't, you know, block it out. I didn't defend myself from the very beginning, as I would do with a lot of other documentary films, because it's so hard having to face other human faces and having to relate to struggling human people. So I think in some way, animation makes it even stronger. And of course, also because, as I said before, this thing that you with the animation can really be expressive. You can really be have visual access in another way than you can with the camera. You can really be descriptive and precise in another way with animation than you can if you do a live action documentary. So to me, it was really also this year that made me realize that this could be done. And then I, of course, watched a lot of other anime documentaries afterwards. But it's there's something about how the animation and the documentary kind of ties together, and you could tell that people just kind of, you know, they move a little bit closer and they start to listen more. And I think it's something to do about the fact that that it's a more open medium somehow. I don't know if it's also because it's something we've been used to watching as kids, that you kind of take it in a better way. But you're right, it's a very philosophical question. I don't know what your opinion is.
I totally agree. Thank you, Jonas. Are there questions from the audience for Jonas? No questions. Okay. I think we, one thing I never told you is that we can see the Flea on Sotto18 Film Festival on the 12th of December in Italian preview, because we will exit, of course, in theater, but in 2022. So I invite you, all of you, to see this beautiful movie. I hope that it will, you loved it as I loved. And now I think we could say goodbye to Jonas. Thank him very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
You too. Have a great day. Bye-bye.